Good afternoon. First, I'd like to also thank Bruce and Adrian for inviting me to participate in this luncheon. I think this is something long overdue, and I think the future is bright. And I think both Samer and Danny and Pam have really set the structure for me to be clean up here, and that's one of the things when you are clean up, they kind of say what your presentation is, but it kind of really hits home what we're trying to do here, and it's trying to solidify the future of these fellowship programs. Danny pointed it out, Samer pointed it out, and so that's what I want to carry on in my presentation. I, too, am an employee of Covidien, and all my compensation is from Covidien. Unfortunately, I don't get to spend it. My wife does. I also want to share in terms of, in full disclosure, being in professional education, I don't report into sales or marketing. I report into one of your peers. Mike Tarnoff is a SAGES member. Mike Tarnoff is a product of the fellowship program, and Mike Tarnoff was also a director of the program. And so we have a strong, close relationship with the Fellowship Council. And before I get into our perspective, I want to just take a little look back in terms of what were some of the major milestones in the history of industry-sponsored fellowships. As Pam pointed out, the first laparoscopic cholecystectomy was back in the late 80s. And it really caught a lot of us off guard. We weren't prepared as industry. We didn't have the technology. You, as the healthcare professionals and educators, were not prepared. But we quickly got into it, and the weekend courses started. And thousands of individuals were trained on the weekend. The results were good, but some of the results were not as good as we wanted. And then the question came, well, how do we train the residents? And so the idea of training residents into a fellowship program came about. And it really blossomed during the Center of Excellence time. And that's when industry and academia got together, and they realized it was incumbent upon all of us that we needed to work together. As industry developed the new technology, we had to work with our academic partners to help train those healthcare professionals to become competent in their ability to safely and effectively use new technology. And the next major milestone was the laparoscopic bypass. That's when we were in a little conference room in Chicago at one of the society meetings talking with the thought leaders as what can we do to teach these residents how to safely and effectively take on this advanced procedure. And we realized due to the success that was happening through the fellowship programs that industry needed to invest more to help educate. And so the funding for a fellowship came along. Another major milestone was the creation of the MIS Fellowship Council at the time, which is now called the Fellowship Council. Because the Fellowship Council, under Adrian's leadership and direction and many others, really brought structure, credibility to what was at the time a very chaotic system. We needed to bring structure to it, and so that program really helped out. And then, here we are today in 2010, probably the most significant change in the funding of fellows for industry because it's going to bring longevity to the program. You saw earlier in Danny's slides, the average cost that is put into the program. And we've heard there's 150 to 200 fellows out there, and you think about what that cost is for industry to fund fellows. Why should we take on that expense? Well, there's certain benefits to it. If you look in the literature, and this has been talked about, so I won't go into too much detail, but the fellows upon graduating felt that they were competent in their skills. It also gave them the guidance and understanding that they was going to prepare them for their academic career or private career. And looking at some of the data, about 50% of the graduates went into academia and the other 50% went into private. So it allowed them to be comfortable, not only for patient care, but also for developing their practice. Looking at the literature in terms of what was Dr. Ali and all, upon graduation, they felt that these individuals were able to safely and effectively perform these advanced procedures as well as their mentor. And that's the true benefit, is that we were going to improve patient care. And that's why industry wanted to do this. And lastly, Shana Qatari's paper, and Shana looked at this early on, the same thing, that upon graduation of these fellowship programs, this was the optimal way of learning how to do bypass. And this information validated what we were looking at. One of the things that we were concerned, if we were going to invest all of this money into these programs, were the fellows receiving the adequate training in their programs. And so we always did in-depth, very confidential surveys to make sure that the fellows upon graduation were receiving it. And you can see from the data over 10 years that about 94% of the fellows felt that they, upon graduation, were receiving that training. And about the same level of those felt that they would recommend those fellowship sites. So that helped validate what we were investing in. And this is before any of the literature came out. And through our conversations and through our relationships with the Fellowship Council and with Adrian, we would share this information to make sure that we were on the right path, because we didn't want to fund a program that was not worthy. So the question is, if everything was going well, why should we change? Well, I think it's been discussed. You know, Pam mentioned it in terms of the conflict of interest. You know, that's out there, and Dan alluded to it, you know, yesterday in, you know, some of this presentation about, you know, the change in tide that's happening between us as industry and you as healthcare professionals or societies. And you just looked in the literature here. You know, this is the editorial that Dan wrote based upon the SAGE's, you know, positioning paper. You know, there's politicians down the street who want to stop this relationship. You know, there's people who are journals, the editors want to stop this relationship between industry and healthcare professionals, industry and medical centers. You look at, this was discussed yesterday in the conflict of interest. Jerry Fried was talking about this yesterday. They want to eliminate CME funding. And as Jerry pointed out yesterday, it's $2 billion spent on CME funding. 60% is provided by industry. So if they're looking to stop $1 billion worth of funding for CME, what's to prevent somebody from coming in and stopping $20 or $30 million to fund fellowships? And then this came out last year at SAGES, the JAMA article, that's saying industry shouldn't fund societies. So because of all of these elements, you know, we got concerned, but then some of the concerns are realistic. This was an article in the New York Times in 2009 where there was a marketing paper showing the return on investment. It showed an investment of 200% for funding fellows. Now, because of those perspectives and articles like this, it led industry to say, you know what, we have to be very proactive. We have to do something, or Big Brother's going to come in and prevent us from doing anything, and then we're all going to fail. We're not going to be able to train those residents. We're not going to have better patient outcomes, and it's also going to hurt in terms of our innovation that we can develop together. So what is the future going to bring? Well, we were at a crossroads. And talking to some of you and hearing some of the feedback, you know, that industry is supporting the foundation because it's an exit strategy. Well, if we wanted to make this an exit strategy, we could have went down the path and used it and said, you know what, we can't fund fellows anymore. But that's not the path that we took. We realized, due to all of the benefits that I mentioned earlier, that we wanted to continue supporting this. And we started having conversations in December of 2008. You know, I was talking with Adrian over in Barcelona. I started conversations with Dr. Radner and Adrian about we need to find a better way. But we knew we couldn't do this alone. And this is where collaboration comes in. If you read some of the articles that I referenced earlier, it talks about pool funding. So I reached out to Evelyn Collazo, who worked for Pam at Ethicon, and I said, we as industry, we have to put our competition aside and we have to collaboratively work together. And we all came to the table with the one goal in mind, that we as industry and the Fellowship Council needs to find a pathway that we can work together. And so with that, and through the hard efforts, they came up with the Foundation for the Surgical Fellowship. And if you look at the mission statement, one of the most important things that I see in there is continued availability. Danny talked about the price that it costs for fellowships and what would happen if we stopped. So our goal and our objective is to really support this new endeavor, to make sure that we can do it. And it falls into all of the things that we heard yesterday in the conflict of interest. This foundation allows us to have total separation. Nobody from the outside can say that we're influencing your decision rights. I can do that with a pen or a cup of coffee. You know, so now we're going to be totally separated. It's going to be transparent. And what's really going to be nice is it's going to be equivalent. The funding that comes from the foundation is going to be the same for everyone. They can't question that. And then it falls into the principles of documentation. Everything is going to be documented. So from an industry's perspective, the idea of moving to this new model is a very good one. It allows us to have a clean relationship. But this type of pooled funding and having the idea of having transparency is not new. You look at the success that we've had working with SAGES, the idea of the FLS program. A couple of years ago, FLS was struggling in terms of its launch within the residency program. There was a need within SAGES. And so industry stepped up and said, okay, we will help you with this endeavor. And this was open to all residency programs and fellowship programs within North America. And the success of this program led to the board, as everybody knows, mandating that all graduating residents take this on. And due to the last report, over 90% of all the chief residents have passed, and they're on target for a 100% successful execution of this. Also, WebSurge, again, industry pooled funding allows this great website that helps educate residents, physicians, healthcare professionals, and it's available for around the world. Over 100,000 people go on to WebSurge every year. It's pooled. There's total transparency. So we have success in this, so we'll have continued success with the foundation. So I think the future is bright, and I think the idea of the Foundation for Surgical Fellowship, will it be successful right out of the gate? There might be some bumps in the road, but you heard yesterday in Dan's talk about Plan B. I think we're getting ahead of Plan B. This might be A1, because if we waited for somebody else to come in and restrict us from funding you and we had to scramble and get this done in a short period of time, it would create a lot more chaos, and we don't want that. So I think the idea of the foundation is a good one. I too want to acknowledge several people that have worked hard over the last 14, 15 months to really get this together. They've worked hard and they've worked collaboratively. And with that, I thank you. I look forward to questions.
Can I just